Hey guys, tonight we settle in for truly luxurious sleep, drifting through the gilded, often deadly halls of history. Tonight we're peeking behind the velvet curtain of ancient palaces, focusing our gentle, sleepy gaze on a puzzle that has kept historians up for centuries why concubines had more power than queens. Imagine yourself now in this sprawling, dimly lit imperial palace. You're trudging across acres of polished jade floors, the cold seeping through your thin silk slippers. Above you, vast, intricate wooden ceilings disappear into the shadows. You're not the king. You're not a servant. You are a fly in the wall, and the air around you is thick with the scent of sandalwood incense and a much heavier, much more intoxicating fragrance power. On one side of this cold, massive chessboard is the queen. You see her in her formal chambers, stiff silk robes, a literal crown of gold and jewels weighing down her neck, surrounded by symbols of her impeccable, untouchable, yet strangely limited authority. She is the sun in the court's sky necessary, acknowledged, and utterly predictable. Her very existence is a political document, a treaty sealed between two powerful houses. If you think about it, she's less a wife and more a very expensive, exquisitely packaged, and legally binding CEO of the royal household. If you had to survive here, you probably wouldn't last 5 minutes trying to argue a point with her. Her power is too formal, too obvious, and too easily targeted. Then, down a much quieter, less traveled corridor, perhaps near a secluded garden, rustling softly in the night breeze, you might catch a glimpse of the concubine. She's wearing something softer, perhaps a fine cotton or light brocade, her hair less rigidly pinned. She is not royalty by birth, but by choice the king's choice. She lacks the queen's legal standing, but oh, you sense the coiled spring of ambition and influence radiating from her. She is not the CEO. She's the highly trusted, indispensable chief of staff who knows every secret, whispers the crucial advice right into the king's ear when he's too relaxed to argue, and specializes in the one product the king actually wants: personalized emotional comfort. This is the initial delicious paradox we're wading into tonight. You naturally assume the woman with the crown, the titles, and the official marriage certificate holds the real sway. But history, that perpetually sleepy prankster, proves otherwise. Time and again, from the Forbidden City to the Ottoman Topkapi Palace, the queen who possessed the legal authority was often overshadowed, outmaneuvered, and even ultimately ruined by the concubine, who possessed personal access. The queen's power was a suit of armor, heavy, formal, protective, but impossible to move quickly in. The concubine's power was a featherlight, pervasive, seemingly inconsequential, but capable of blowing a vital document off the king's desk and into her favor. One mainstream historical fact to put a pin in this idea early on is the sheer burden of the queen's role. In many cultures, like ancient China, the queen was held responsible not just for her behavior, but for the entire fertility and moral health of the dynasty. Any famine, any illness, any earthquake, it could and often did get blamed on the queen's lack of virtue or the imbalance of her family's influence. Talk about job pressure. Imagine trying to sleep when the crops failing 500 miles away might cost you your head. Meanwhile, the concubine, bless her heart, was judged on a much simpler metric. Did the king smile today? If she delivered comfort, entertainment, and distraction, she was succeeding. This freedom from political and cosmic responsibility gave her a flexibility that was denied to the rigidly structured queen. The quirky tidbit here, a little thing historians sometimes overlook, is the difference in palace architecture. The queen's quarters were typically at the structural and ceremonial heart of the palace, massive, cold, and always under observation. The concubines were housed in smaller, more intimate, often labyrinthine quarters further back. These spaces, though physically smaller, provided the crucial shield of privacy and the social fluidity necessary for low-key politicking. They became zones of quiet gossip alliance building and the trading of non-official favors, a sort of ancient, pre-internet harem underground that the queen, trapped by her own ceremony, could never penetrate. It's the difference between running a multinational corporation from a glass tower and running a successful informal network from a cozy, dimly lit speakeasy. We see this pattern repeat across continents and centuries. The queen is constrained by the weight of her political family, her father, her brothers, their demands for appointments and prestige. She is a package deal, and the king often tires of the political baggage that comes with her dowry. The concubine, she usually comes with no demanding family. She is entirely dependent on the king's personal favor, and that dependence ironically makes her a more trustworthy confidant in personal matters. She has nowhere to go but up and only through him. Historians still argue whether the power dynamics were purely a function of gender or fundamentally a matter of legal structure. Was the concubine's influence simply a female way of wielding power when legal channels were closed, or was her power a direct result of the absence of legal constraints that weighed down the queen? That is the quiet, complex question we'll allow to drift through our minds tonight. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you are in the world and what time it is for you right now. It's always fun to know who's nodding off where. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together, pushing past the heavy throne room doors and into the whisper-filled corridors of real subtle power. You are now leaving the land of official titles and entering the land of midnight confessions, where the concubine holds the king's heart and sometimes the fate of an empire. We glide now from the paradox itself to the concrete realities of the palace day, settling our attention on the distinct and irreconcilable roles placed upon the queen versus the concubine. This isn't just a difference in title. It's a difference in job description, so profound it dictated who got to make decisions, and more importantly, who got to whisper the deciding factors. The fundamental division we explore here is a queen's duty versus a concubine's wiles. You watch the queen rise, and already her day is a grueling public performance. Her duties are rigid, formal, and reproductive. She is the living embodiment of the state's continuity. Her primary non-negotiable mission is to produce the legitimate heir, a male child born under the most formal and politically scrutinized conditions. If she succeeds, great. Her power is cemented, but her schedule is now locked down with state affairs, ancestral rights, and supervising a massive domestic staff. If she fails to produce a son, or worse, if she produces only daughters, her legal status quickly becomes a political liability and a source of overwhelming anxiety. She is essentially a highly decorated incubator whose value is perpetually measured by her output. Her power, while immense on paper, is mostly delegated and symbolic. You rarely see the queen chatting idly with the king. She is too busy presiding over rituals, hosting foreign delegations, or managing the complex finances of her court. She is the CEO who is constantly in board meetings. Now let's turn our sleepy gaze toward the concubine. Her role is delightfully strategically different. She is explicitly freed from those crushing official burdens. Her job is to specialize in personal pleasure and companionship. She is not judged by the grandeur of her public appearances or the purity of her lineage. She is judged by her ability to make the king forget the endless suffocating burdens of kingship. She is the retreat, the soft place he can land after a day of treason, plots, budget crises, and squabbling ministers. This difference in specialization is the true secret weapon of the concubine. She has the time and the mandate to focus on the king's person, while the queen is focused on the king's office. Think about it. Who do you confide in, the person who keeps reminding you of your responsibilities, or the person who helps you momentarily escape them? The concubine is intimately aware of his favorite foods, his subtle shifts in mood, the jokes that actually make him laugh, the anxieties that keep him awake at 3 a.m. This close observed emotional knowledge is currency the queen simply cannot afford to trade in. The queen must maintain an air of stately remove. The concubine can be vulnerable, playful, even irreverent, whatever the king needs to feel human. One mainstream historical fact that illustrates this is the concept of the nightly roster in Chinese imperial history. While the queen had official ceremonial nights with the emperor, concubines were often called upon based on a literal roll call, a small act of personal choice that subtly eroded the queen's official precedence. An emperor could for months simply choose not to summon the queen while rotating through his favored concubines. This sustained physical and emotional absence meant the queen was literally left out of the loop politically and personally. This brings us to a quirky tidbit, the highly refined art of scent and atmosphere. Because the concubine's power rested entirely on her personal appeal, she mastered the details of the intimate environment. Historians have records describing the various specialized perfumes, essential oils, and even specific types of finely woven bedding used by favored concubines. This wasn't vanity. It was operational security. Her chambers were designed to be a sensory contrast to the cold marble and incense of the queen's official residence. She controlled the light, the temperature, the music, the scent. She curated an entire microclimate of affection. The king entered her space and could momentarily drop the weight of his crown. You simply cannot govern an empire from a room that smells like jasmine and quiet flattery. That's her secret weapon. The governing stops at the door. Imagine the king has just spent 6 hours dealing with a revolt on the northern border. He's stressed, tired, and probably wants to just complain about his chief minister. The queen, duty-bound, will likely offer politically sound but emotionally cold advice, perhaps suggesting a punitive military action, reminding him of his duty to the ancestors. The concubine, however, will offer a foot massage, a cup of warm wine, and a perfectly timed, gentle complaint about a minor courtyard official who had the audacity to scold her maid. In deflecting his stress to a tiny, manageable problem, she makes him feel competent and relaxed. Then, when he's vulnerable, perhaps she'll mention ever so lightly that it was actually her cousin who was perfect for that vacant tax collector position. Just a thought, my lord. Historians still argue whether the perceived sexuality of the concubine was the primary driver of her influence or merely a Trojan horse for deeper political access. Was the king truly enthralled by her charms, or did he simply gravitate toward the space where he could exercise unrestricted personal choice, free from the ceremonial judgment of the queen? It's a subtle but important distinction, power by seduction versus power by emotional availability. We tend to focus on the romantic drama, but the real power was in the concubine's ability to create a non-judgmental, pressure-free listening environment. In the palace hierarchy, the queen was the sun you gazed at from afar. The concubine was the warm hearth you huddled next to on a cold night. And when you're a tired king facing a civil war and an empty treasury, you're probably going to spend a lot more time by the fire than staring at the sky. The slow, quiet revolution of concubine power continues as we turn our attention now to a vital, often fatal distinction, the origins of the queen versus the origins of the concubine. This is the section where we dissect the peril of royal marriage alliances, a burden that shackled the queen and gave the concubine a crucial strategic advantage. In most dynastic systems, you must remember, the queen was rarely a romantic choice. She was a political import. You are watching the king, and you realize his marriage is essentially a treaty, a contract sealed with another powerful family, another kingdom, or a critically needed regional ally. She arrives with a massive, impressive dowry, yes, but she also arrives with a massive, complicated entourage, her own network of ambitious relatives, demanding officials, and often foreign loyalties. She is an anchor that prevents the king from drifting politically, which sounds stable, but anchors can also be very heavy when you need to sail quickly in a new direction. The political significance of the queen is her great strength, but also her overwhelming weakness. She is a political liability. Every action she takes, every request she makes, and every child she bears is viewed through the lens of her family's ambitions. If the king decides to go to war with her ancestral kingdom, her position becomes instantly untenable, possibly treasonous. If her father or brother becomes too powerful, the king must actively work to suppress his own wife's family, to maintain his power, leading to endless domestic strife. Now contrast this with the concubine. She is almost always a domestic choice, often selected from lower-ranking noble families, the local gentry, or occasionally even from the ranks of palace servants, though the latter, while dramatic, was rarer for the most powerful concubines. Crucially, she is politically unburdened. She does not bring a powerful, demanding clan into the palace. Her family, if they exist, are minor players whose elevation is entirely dependent on her continued personal favor with the king. They pose no dynastic or military threats. This absence of demanding, powerful relatives creates a crucial psychological dynamic. The king can trust the concubine's advice as being personal, not political. When she whispers a suggestion, it's not immediately interpreted as a coded demand from a foreign minister or a power play by an ambitious uncle. This is where her soft power begins to truly solidify. She becomes the king's safe space, the person he can vent to about the very political alliances that the queen represents. One mainstream historical fact that showcases this is the intense scrutiny placed on queen mothers who were foreign princesses. In the Byzantine Empire, for instance, a queen's ethnic background could be a source of immediate suspicion and plotting, often leading to xenophobic accusations, and even forced exile or poisoning when political winds shifted. Their identity was tied to external powers, making them perpetual outsiders in the court's core political life. The quirky or fringe tidbit here relates to the concept of the clean slate. Concubines, especially those selected from the palace staff or minor families, often had a minimal documented history. They were not tainted by previous political maneuvering or existing vendettas between noble houses. This clean slate made them incredibly attractive to kings tired of the endless generational feuds of the high nobility. The king, in choosing her, was engaging in an act of pure sovereign will, which was liberating for him. He was creating a new loyal power base that answered only to him, sidestepping the rigid rules of primogeniture and inherited loyalty. You can almost hear the king sighing with relief, saying, "Finally, someone who doesn't remind me of my obligation to my cousin's disastrous land deal." Consider the common tactic of foreign queens who felt marginalized. They would often resort to secret correspondence with their birth courts, essentially running a shadow diplomatic mission from within the palace walls. This was a necessity for their survival, but if discovered, it was catastrophic. The concubine, meanwhile, was corresponding about something much less treasonous. Maybe the need for new silk for her robes or a small loan for a distant relative's failing vineyard. Her concerns were internal, domestic, and manageable. Historians still argue whether the king's attraction to the concubine was a genuine display of romantic affection or a calculated political maneuver to rebalance power away from overly dominant foreign families. Was the king truly falling in love with the unburdened woman? Or was he strategically weaponizing a lower status relationship to neutralize the threat posed by his legally powerful but politically restrictive spouse? It's a classic case of passion versus pragmatism. In the cold, calculus-driven world of royal power, ultimately, the queen's crown was heavy because it was paid for by political debts. The concubine's slippers were light because she owed nothing to anyone but the man who loved or needed her. And in a cutthroat royal court, the person who owes nothing is often the freest to maneuver. Our gentle journey through the palace continues, and we arrive at the pivotal, most high-stakes point of this entire power dynamic, the birth of a child. This is where the queen's legal certainty meets the concubine's sheer unpredictable luck, and the concubine often wins. This section is all about the power of the unexpected pregnancy. Remember, the queen's power is tied to producing the legitimate heir, typically the firstborn male. This child is a dynastic guarantee, his birth celebrated with state fanfare and documented meticulously in royal records. He is the pre-approved, politically correct future of the realm. However, this formality is a double-edged sword. If the queen fails to conceive quickly, or worse, if she produces only daughters, her position and the political fortunes of her entire family become incredibly precarious. The palace becomes a ticking clock, and every barren month diminishes her power. Now consider the concubine. She is in a constant state of flux, always striving for greater status, and her path is often one of calculated risk and intimate strategy. When she becomes pregnant, particularly if the queen has not yet produced a son, the entire calculus of the court shatters. Her pregnancy is an instant, unauthorized threat to the queen's dynastic security. It's not just a baby. It's a living, breathing wild card. The beauty of the concubine's position is that her son, while technically lower in rank, is personally loved by the king and is unburdened by the queen's political baggage. The king sees the child of the queen as a necessary political continuation. He sees the child of the concubine as an act of personal affection and divine blessing. And when that child is male, he immediately becomes a viable, sometimes preferable, alternative heir. Imagine the king's thought process. The queen's son will be molded by her ambitious family and the stuffy state advisors. The concubine's son, however, is perceived as being his own, a continuation of his personal, private self. The king often feels a closer, more immediate bond to the child born from personal affection than the one born from political duty. The concubine leverages this sentimental advantage perfectly. One mainstream historical fact that highlights this dynamic is the system of concubinage grades in Imperial China. While a son born to the queen was the Dai-son, legitimate heir, a son born to a high-ranking concubine was the Shu-son, secondary son. The key is that while the Dai-son had precedence if he were deemed unworthy or if the queen had no son, the emperor had the prerogative to elevate a Shu-son to heir, often after intense lobbying and emotional persuasion from the concubine mother. This elevation could instantly change the fate of an empire. The quirky or fringe tidbit in this area is the prevalence of fertility rituals and charms utilized by concubines. They were not just competing on charm, they were often aggressively, sometimes dangerously utilizing ancient folk remedies, specialized diets, and elaborate religious rites to increase their chances of conception, and crucially, to ensure the birth of a male child. While the queen's fertility was a public, medically monitored affair, the concubines operated in a shadowy world of midwives, herbalists, and whispered knowledge, turning the act of conception into a high-stakes spiritual and personal project. It was the difference between using modern medicine and deploying an army of personalized witch doctors. The latter, in a superstitious court, often felt more potent. When the concubine gives birth to a boy, her status is no longer a matter of the king's fleeting affection. It becomes a matter of dynastic reality. Her power shifts from being merely an emotional counselor to being the mother of a potential king. Even if the queen eventually has a son, the concubine's son is already there, already bonded with the father, already a factor in the succession planning. Historians still argue whether the power shift after a concubine's birth of a male heir was driven more by the king's genuine emotional preference for the mother, or if it was a cold, politically pragmatic choice to favor a son without the heavy, often burdensome, political liabilities of the queen's family. Did the king love the concubine, or did he simply see her son as a useful tool to counterbalance the power of the queen's clan? It is a question that requires us to look beyond the titles and into the dark, complicated heart of the king himself. This single event, the unexpected pregnancy, permanently changes the power balance. The queen is now fighting a defensive war against a rival who has nothing to lose and a powerful, innocent baby boy to gain everything for. We now move into the king's private quarters, the soft, plush heart of the palace where the concubine truly executes her strategy. We've established the legal limitations of the queen and the dynastic opportunity of the concubine. Now we examine the actual mechanism of their influence, which resides entirely within the emotional economy of the bedchamber. If the palace is a vast corporation, the queen is the public-facing chairman of the board. The concubine, however, is the executive coach who gets 24/7 access to the chairman's private thoughts. Her power is not formal, it is intimate manipulation, exploiting the ruler's personal vulnerabilities, moods, and deep-seated insecurities. The queen, bound by ceremony, must always treat the king as the sacred ruler. This means her interactions are often stiff, deferential, and predictable. She reinforces the distance between the mortal man and the divine monarch. The concubine, by contrast, is allowed and even encouraged to treat the king as a man. She doesn't just flatter his office, she praises his terrible jokes, listens patiently to his complaints about his dull-witted generals, and offers small, personalized gestures of care that break through the emotional isolation of kingship. This consistent, low-level emotional investment creates a profound, invisible bond. Think of the king coming home after a terrible day of taxing his subjects and signing death warrants. He's weighed down by the loneliness of command. The queen reminds him of his majesty and his duties. The concubine reminds him that he's an ordinary guy with extraordinary stress. She is the psychological pressure valve. And the moment that pressure valve is open, the concubine can delicately insert a tiny, crucial piece of suggestion. She never orders or demands as a queen, might have to. She asks questions. My lord, that minister of war seemed rather cold toward you today. Is he perhaps overstepping his bounds, or I know you are worried about the treasury, but perhaps if the tax was collected by someone more. Personally loyal to you, like my helpful cousin, this is the mastery of intimate influence, planting a seed of doubt or a flicker of preference directly into the king's mind when he is most relaxed and least guarded. One mainstream historical fact to note is that a significant number of political purges and dismissals in imperial courts across the world from Rome to the Ming dynasty were initiated not by formal councils but by the king's sudden, seemingly irrational distrust of a high-ranking official. Historians often trace these sudden shifts back to the influence of a favored concubine who used emotional intelligence to portray a rival as disloyal, incompetent, or a threat to the king's personal well-being rather than his state power. The quirky tidbit here is the concubine's use of the long silence. Unlike the queen, who was expected to speak precisely and formally, a favored concubine could often achieve more by not speaking. If the king brought up a minister she disliked, she might respond with a long, pensive silence, a small, subtle frown, or a delicate sigh, leaving the king to fill in the blank with his own darkest suspicions. Her nonverbal cues became weapons of psychological warfare, making the king believe he was reaching a conclusion independently, which of course made the decision far more powerful. This psychological technique is far more effective than the queen's direct, argumentative approach. This leads to the question of the pillow talk dossier. The concubine, who spends hours in intimate, unguarded conversation with the king, inevitably learns all his secrets, his fears, his feuds, his weaknesses, and his personal debts. This is intelligence that no minister or queen can access. She holds the master key to his decision-making process because she knows the emotional reason behind the king's political action. This knowledge is her supreme, unofficial power. Historians still argue whether this profound emotional dependence constituted actual political power, or if it was simply the proximate cause for the king's decisions. In other words, did the concubine wield power, or was she simply the most efficient channel through which the king's own latent desires and paranoia were expressed? While her name might not appear on a decree, her influence, like that crocodile dung sunscreen we didn't mention earlier, but which was definitely a thing in ancient beauty routines, was pervasive and subtly corrosive to her rivals. The effect, in any case, was the same. The concubine's opinion mattered more than the queen's official advice. Let's shift our gaze away from the king's personal chambers for a moment and look into the deeper, quieter currents of the palace structure itself. While the queen is bound by the visible official court, the concubine operates within an informal yet incredibly potent system of intelligence and allegiance, what we call the network of the harem underground. Imagine the queen's court as a massive, brightly lit main street. Everything is official, documented, and moves slowly. Now imagine the concubine's world as the interconnected, shadowy back alleys where the real trading and communication happen. The power here is derived not from formal rank, but from shared vulnerability and shared information. The concubines collectively occupied a massive, multi-tiered structure in the palace. They ranged from the highly favored to the utterly neglected. But they shared one crucial thing, a vested interest in the king's decisions, and a fundamental lack of formal legal protection. This shared precarity forced them to form complex, non-official alliances. This network was fueled by the two groups with the most access to the palace's secrets, the eunuchs and the servant women. The queen, due to her rank, dealt with the highest level, most formally trained officials. The concubines, however, often maintain closer, more personal relationships with the thousands of lower-ranking staff who were the actual eyes and ears of the palace. These staff members saw and heard everything from which minister was seen crying in the courtyard to the king's muttered complaint about a rival kingdom's ambassador. This is where the concubine's power became decentralized. She could trade favors promising a maid, a better posting, or a eunuch, a subtle gift, in exchange for crucial raw intelligence. She knew which minister was vulnerable to scandal, which general was drinking too much, and which faction was about to propose a new, unpopular tax. The queen, receiving only formalized reports, was often operating with outdated or sanitized data. The concubine had the real-time intelligence feed, piped directly through her personal network of informants. One mainstream historical fact demonstrating this is the documented influence of eunuch-concubine alliances in several dynasties, most famously in the later periods of the Chinese Empire. Powerful concubines cultivated relationships with the highest-ranking and most strategically placed eunuchs who controlled access to the emperor and managed vast bureaucratic systems. This partnership created an impervious parallel power structure, the concubine providing the emotional key to the king and the eunuch providing the logistical power of the bureaucracy. Together, they could effectively sideline the queen's formal administration. The quirky or fringe tidbit here is the use of gossip as a political weapon. In the harem underground, the spreading of information was not idle chatter. It was a highly sophisticated method of political manipulation. A concubine who needed to undermine a rival would not confront her. She would quietly let it be known among the servants that the rival's tea had a strange metallic smell, or that the rival had been seen consulting with a shady soothsayer. This insidious low-level rumor campaign could destroy a rival's reputation for loyalty or virtue long before the queen was even aware a conflict existed. It was death by 1,000 whispers. Consider the complexity. The queen is busy managing her external political alliances. The concubine is busy managing her internal intelligence alliances. She knows, for example, that the queen's cousin, who is a general, is secretly planning a maneuver. The concubine can casually mention to the king during a quiet moment, "My lord, I had a terrible dream last night about General so-and-so. He seemed to be riding far from the capital. I hope he is safe and happy on the front lines." This plants the seed of suspicion, without ever providing a verifiable, traceable piece of evidence, ensuring the king initiates the investigation himself. Historians still argue whether the power of the harem underground was a deliberate counter-political system designed by women to circumvent formal exclusion, or if it was merely an inevitable consequence of human nature and information asymmetry within a highly restricted environment. Was it strategy or simply survival? Regardless, it provided the concubine with the agility and knowledge necessary to continually surprise and outmaneuver the slow-moving, heavily observed queen. Remember that subtle, pervasive influence of the jasmine scent we mentioned. It masked a complex web of espionage and alliance building. As we continue our exploration of palace power dynamics, we shift our focus from personal influence and network intelligence to the cold, hard reality of money and resources. This section examines the queen as budget line item, how the queen's very formality made her a financial liability, while the concubine's adaptability allowed for subtle accumulation of wealth and influence. The queen, you observe, is astonishingly expensive. Her establishment is vast, public, and fixed. She requires a colossal budget for her court, her enormous retinue, her public ceremonies, her state charities, and her diplomatic duties. This budget is meticulously recorded, highly scrutinized by ministers, and represents a massive drain on the royal treasury. Her expenditures are public knowledge, and every penny spent on her lavish lifestyle is a potential source of political resentment, both from the populace and from rival factions who can criticize the waste. She is the massive, inefficient government agency, complete with all the requisite oversight and bureaucratic red tape. The king, who is always worried about money and rebellion, and maybe that crocodile dung sunscreen, because who can keep up with ancient beauty standards, often views the queen's massive, inflexible expenditure with a weary eye. Her financial needs are a political obligation, not a source of personal pleasure. Now consider the concubine. Her support structure is typically much smaller, more private, and significantly more adaptable. She does not manage a state treasury. She manages personal gifts and private revenue streams. When the king favors her, she doesn't get a massive, audited budget increase. She receives smaller, specific gifts, a rare piece of jewelry, a tract of land, a tax exemption on a specific commodity, or a subtle appointment of one of her loyal servants to a revenue-generating post. These resources are often managed off the books outside the purview of the royal auditors. She has a crucial advantage: financial invisibility. Her wealth and influence are subtle, private, and flexible. She can use a rare diamond received as a gift to fund a bribe or leverage a piece of land to reward a loyal eunuch. Her money is entirely fungible and serves her political goals directly without the need for public approval or ministerial review. She is the successful, agile, private business that sidesteps bureaucratic hassle. One mainstream historical fact illustrating this is the use of fiefdoms and personal endowments in many cultures, particularly in East Asia. While the queen's endowments were often massive, but restricted by state law, concubines were frequently given smaller, more profitable personal estates, sometimes managed by their own, often unscrupulous relatives. These lands, while minor on the national map, provided crucial liquid cash flow directly to the concubine's personal coffers, bypassing the official bureaucracy completely. The quirky or fringe tidbit here is the concubine's mastery of the soft petition for resources. A queen had to formally request funds from the king, often involving ministers and public discussion. A concubine, utilizing her emotional economy skills, remember those from Section 5, would never formally ask. She would lament in a quiet moment how she couldn't properly host a small, intimate tea because her silks were becoming threadbare, or how a minor ritual could not be conducted without a particularly rare spice. A spice which, incidentally, was controlled by a trading house she wanted to undermine. The king, eager to soothe her minor distress and display his personal affection, would often grant her a valuable concession, like the aforementioned tax exemption, far exceeding the cost of the spice, all under the guise of a small romantic gesture. This brings us to the core financial difference. The queen's expenditures were seen as a cost to the kingdom. The concubines were the kingdom's bounty, a personal reward for the king's love. The king liked seeing his personal generosity expressed privately, through the concubine, rather than seeing his state funds locked up publicly in the queen's endless ceremonies. Historians still argue whether the concubine's financial power was derived from her strategic avoidance of formal accounting, or if the king was simply using her as an unofficial budget line item to funnel resources to his personally preferred political operators. Was she an independent financial force, or a discreet proxy for the king's own secret spending? In either case, the outcome was the same. The concubine had control over more usable, flexible, and politically powerful cash than the queen, whose funds were effectively trapped behind walls of red tape. You can't bribe a guard with a state-issued tax receipt, but you can certainly do it with a gold nugget slipped under a pillow. Building upon the concubine's mastery of the emotional economy and her financially invisible networks, we now observe how this subtle influence translated into concrete political results. We move from the personal to the bureaucratic, focusing on small gifts and quiet favors the lobby. The queen, confined by her high rank and public role, was expected to deal with major state business treaties, large-scale military appointments, and dynastic marriages. Her lobbying was overt formal and often conducted through established ministerial channels. She sought big political wins that benefited her family and solidified the state's hierarchy. The concubine's game was entirely different and far more effective in the day-to-day running of the palace and the government. She specialized in brokering minor political access and influencing judicial or bureaucratic appointments, the small gears that make the vast machine of government turn. She was the palace's most efficient and discreet lobbyist. If a mid-level bureaucrat needed an audience with the king to discuss a minor yet crucial policy change he couldn't easily approach the queen, she would require a formal petition, a delay of weeks, and the scrutiny of her entire staff. But he could often, through a carefully chosen intermediary or a subtle, generous gift, a rare, beautiful jade carving, perhaps discreetly reach the concubine. She, in turn, would not schedule an official meeting. Instead, she would ensure the bureaucrat was coincidentally positioned in the king's antechamber when he was in a good mood, or she would simply mention the issue during their intimate evening talk. "My lord, that poor man who oversees the rice paddies, he seems so genuinely distressed about the new canal route. Perhaps a brief word with him would ease his mind and yours." The concubine, by mediating these small acts of access, became the gatekeeper of the king's personal attention. This was power far more valuable than the queen's legal authority. A judge who gets his promotion because the king's favorite lady put in a word will forever owe his loyalty to the concubine, not the queen, and certainly not the formal bureaucracy. One mainstream historical fact here is the way minor judicial decisions were often swayed by court favorites. Historically, a king could issue thousands of minor decrees in a year, and he rarely had the attention span or energy to thoroughly review them all. The concubine, informed by her networks, could slip a suggestion for clemency for one party or harsher punishment for another into the king's ear just before he signed a stack of documents. These micro-decisions could ruin or enrich families and build massive, quiet political debts owed directly to the concubine. The quirky or fringe tidbit concerns the use of pets or minor children as lobbying proxies. A clever concubine might have a king's beloved pampered parrot or dog. She would train the animal to interact with specific people she wished to favor or bring to the king's attention. Even more powerfully, a small, charming royal child, the concubine's son, could be prompted to innocently ask the king, "Father, why is Minister X always so sad when he leaves your room?" This uses the king's own affection for his child to introduce a political narrative, bypassing the queen's formal filters entirely. It's an adorable yet deadly form of politics. Think of it, the queen's lobbying is a formal letter stamped with the royal seal. The concubine's lobbying is a perfectly timed, seemingly accidental whisper during a slow dance. Which one do you think the king finds more compelling? The queen offers duty. The concubine offers a smooth path, a personal recommendation, and an emotional bribe. Historians still argue whether the cumulative effect of these small, unofficial appointments and favors the building of a personal bureaucracy ultimately made the concubine's power more enduring than the queen's power, which was constantly subject to formal, dramatic purges. The queen's downfall was typically a public execution. The concubine's rivals were taken down by slow, quiet poisoning of the king's opinion, one quiet favor at a time. The power of the whisper is always faster than the pace of the written decree. We now turn our attention to the moment the concubine's investment in soft power fully pays off, achieving a status that even the queen must envy, becoming the mother of the future king. This profound dynastic shift is what we call the unbreakable bond of mother and son. You've witnessed the concubine use charm, wits, and networks to gain influence, but all of that was temporary, tied to the king's fleeting personal affection. The birth of a son, however, creates a permanent legal and dynastic anchor for her power. Her influence, once subtle and unofficial, now gains a colossal political shield. The concubine's power truly peaked when her son born a secondary heir, a Shu son, as we mentioned earlier, was either formally adopted by the queen, which happened surprisingly often, to solidify the succession, or more dramatically, when he was elevated by the king to be the designated crown prince. That decision retrospectively validated every strategic move the concubine had ever made. She transitions overnight from being the king's favorite to being the mother of the realm's future. This maternal bond is unbreakable in a way the marital bond is not. A queen can be divorced, exiled, or even executed, but a mother once acknowledged is almost impossible to fully erase from the dynastic line, especially if her son holds the throne. Her son, once crowned, owes his entire elevated status to her persistence, her maneuvering, and her success in keeping him alive and in favor. This loyalty is profound. The king's love is a gift. The son's loyalty is a political necessity for both of them. When the son takes the throne, the former concubine often becomes the dowager empress or queen mother, the most powerful female figure in the land. Her power is no longer based on the fragile, emotional economy of the bedchamber. It's based on the unwavering authority of her ruling son. She has successfully navigated the choppy waters of middle age to become a powerful matriarch. One mainstream historical fact, to hammer this point home, is the historical tendency for newly enthroned sons of concubines to drastically elevate their mother's deceased or exiled family. These sons often use their imperial authority to retroactively grant their mother's family titles, land and positions, sometimes even building them lavish tombs and ancestral temples. This was a public acknowledgement that their mother was the true foundation of their power, a move that often eclipsed the power of the official queen's clan. The quirky tidbit here relates to the cult of the loving mother. A clever concubine, knowing her status was fragile while the king lived, would heavily cultivate a public image of fierce maternal devotion, not just to her son, but to the entire idea of motherhood. This made attacking her a politically treacherous move, as it cast her rival, the queen, as cruel and jealous, acting against the natural order. She weaponized societal expectations of maternal sacrifice to protect her ambition, making herself seem too morally pure, or at least too popular to touch. Think of the dynamic once the concubine's son is crown prince. The queen must now treat her former rival with deference and respect, knowing that the woman she once looked down upon will soon be her senior in the court hierarchy. The concubine, who mastered the art of quiet flattery, remember that gentle sarcasm we mentioned earlier can now dispense power with a quiet, knowing smile, having successfully played the long game. Historians still argue whether the son of a concubine, upon ascending the throne, was genuinely acting out of filial piety in elevating his mother, or if he was simply making a strategic move to consolidate his own power by creating a new, personally loyal power block. that was independent of the entrenched, often hostile factions of the former queen's family. Did he love her, or was he just using her network to rule? It's a classic political dilemma, proving that the victory of the mother's influence was in the end a political one. Now that we've seen the general trajectory of concubine power, we'll ground our theory in one of history's most spectacular and decisive case studies. This is where the informal soft power principles we've discussed coalesced into ultimate absolute rule, historical case study, Wu Zetian's ascent. You are now in 7th century Tang Dynasty China, watching a story that proves the concubine system was not just about favors and titles. It could lead to the imperial throne itself. Wu Zhao, later known as Wu Zetian, started her career in the palace not as a high-ranking queen, but as a low-level consort, a type of concubine to Emperor Taizong. Her initial status was low, politically negligible, and entirely dependent on the emperor's attention. Wu Zetian perfectly navigated the system we've been describing. First, she mastered the emotional economy of the Bedchamber Section 5. Even while serving the aging Emperor Taizong, she was quietly establishing a crucial bond with his son Prince Ji, who would later become Emperor Gaozong. When Taizong died, she was relegated to a convent, as was customary for concubines without children. This exile should have been the end of her story. But her personal connection to Gaozong was so strong, the bond of a shared intimate secret, that he broke tradition and brought her back to the palace, giving her a low-ranking title. This was her second major win. She was a personal choice, unburdened by political alliances. Section 3, and her return was a triumph of private will over public ceremony. The critical stage was her direct confrontation with the existing Empress Wang and a senior consort, Xiao. Empress Wang had the legal authority, Section 1, and the political family backing. Wu Zhao had personal access and fierce strategic intelligence, Section 6. Historians generally agree that Wu Zhao relentlessly used rumors, gossip, and carefully orchestrated incidents, her harem underground, at its deadly peak, to sow distrust between the emperor and his queen. One mainstream historical fact regarding her ascent is the infamous incident. Historians still debate the full truth, where Empress Wang was implicated in the death of Wu's infant daughter. Whether Wu Zetian committed the act herself or merely used the death as political leverage, the result was a catastrophic emotional breakdown of the king's trust in the empress. This emotional breach, far more than any legal transgression, was the death knell for the queen. The king needed emotional comfort and certainty, and Wu Zhao provided it, while the queen offered only scandal and suspicion. The quirky or fringe tidbit from this part of her life is the depth of her alliance with the eunuchs and court officials whom the empress had alienated. Wu Zetian was known for her exceptional memory and willingness to engage directly with lower-level staff, soliciting their advice and rewarding their loyalty, often with small gifts and quiet favors. Section 8. This personal touch built a loyal faction that dwarfed the support for the cold, ceremonial Empress Wang. Wu Zetian knew the names of the gardeners, the clerks, and the guards, and they, in turn, fed her the information she needed to destroy her rivals. In 655 CE, the emperor, overwhelmed by Wu Zetian's influence and convinced of the queen's disloyalty, formally deposed Empress Wang. Wu Zhao, the low-ranking concubine, was installed as the new empress. She had transitioned from soft power to formal power. Historians still argue whether Emperor Gaozong was so genuinely weak-willed and lovesick that he allowed Wu Zetian to ascend, or if he was a calculated political actor who used her to neutralize the immense, suffocating power of the established noble families that Empress Wang represented. Either way, Zetian's subsequent career, where she effectively ruled through the emperor, and then after his death through her sons, eventually proclaiming herself emperor in 690 CE, proves the concubine's path, when perfectly executed, could be the most powerful route of all. The concubine's slipper, once light, became the solid foundation for a new iron throne. We have spent much time charting the concubine's ascent, making her power seem inevitable, but our sleepy historical journey now demands a moment of crucial reality. We must acknowledge the razor's edge she walked every single day by examining the downside of power instability and risk. The concubine's influence, as we established, was built on personal affection and unofficial networks. This made her powerful, but it also made her existence intensely vulnerable and inherently competitive. Her power was an unwritten contract, constantly under review by the king's ever-shifting mood and the relentless plotting of her rivals. One wrong step, one subtle change in the scent of the king's sandalwood. Remember that atmospheric control could mean instant disgrace, exile, or even death. You probably won't survive this career path. The concubine's life was a permanent state of high-stakes competition. Unlike the queen, whose status was legally protected by dynastic treaties and tradition, the concubine was in a pool of dozens, sometimes hundreds of rivals, all competing for the same singular resource, the king's attention. Every pregnancy, every successful favor brokered, and every expensive gift received simply increased the size of the target painted on her back by every other woman in the palace. The king's favor, her only source of power, was notoriously fickle. A king could easily become tired of her personality, distracted by a newer, younger face, or persuaded by a minister that her influence was becoming too politically inconvenient. Her power was a flame that needed constant, intimate tending. If the king stopped summoning her for a few weeks, her network of eunuchs and servants would instantly abandon her, knowing she could no longer repay their loyalty. She would transition overnight from a source of favor to a political pariah. One mainstream historical fact that highlights this instability is the ritualistic and often brutal punishment of concubines who fell out of favor. In cultures like the Ottoman Empire, a disgraced concubine could be swiftly exiled to the old palace, a place of isolated destitution, or in more ruthless courts. Like certain Chinese dynasties, she could be stripped of her rank, imprisoned, tortured, or even executed, often on dubious charges of witchcraft or poisoning. The penalty for failure was total erasure, unlike the queen, who might only suffer political setbacks. The quirky or fringe tidbit here is the concubine's fear of the reverse dowager scenario. While we discuss the triumph of becoming a dowager empress through a ruling son, Section 9, a greater fear was falling out of favor after having borne the king a son. To protect the purity of the succession and prevent the son from being corrupted by his low-status mother, some kings would execute the mother shortly after the son's birth, or official designation as heir, a cold-blooded preventative measure. This was the ultimate betrayal, achieving the goal of motherhood only to pay for it with her life, ensuring her son was raised without her taint. This high-risk, high-reward environment meant the concubine could never relax. She had to constantly analyze the king's health, the political climate, the gossip from the Harem underground, remember that intelligence network, and the movements of her enemies. She was a professional political athlete, constantly in training. The queen, by contrast, could afford to be dull and formal. Her power was ensured. The concubine had to be brilliant and adaptable every day. Historians still argue whether the fierce competition among concubines was a factor that ultimately destabilized the throne by introducing endless plots and power struggles, or if it actually made the king's government more effective. by ensuring he was served by the most ambitious, clever, and politically attuned women in the realm. It's a paradox. The internal chaos was a necessary byproduct of the concubine's intense, personalized drive for survival, a drive that often led to brilliant, if ruthlessly executed, political maneuvers. The soft power came at a very hard price. Our exploration of the concubine's power now takes a detour into the fascinating realm of legal fictions, the clever ways that rigid, dynastic rules could be bent, if not entirely broken. We focus on the cultural and legal loophole of adoption, a strategic maneuver that could dramatically change a concubine's social and dynastic standing without changing her birth status. Remember that a queen's child was the legitimate heir, the die son, whereas a concubine's child was the secondary heir, the shoe son. Remember that distinction from Section 4. This legal disparity was the greatest obstacle to the concubine's ambition. However, in many imperial systems, necessity and the king's desperate need for an heir created a crucial loophole: formal adoption. When the queen was barren, or perhaps only had daughters, and the king desperately needed a male successor, the solution was often to have the queen formally adopt the son of a favored concubine. This maneuver was a political masterstroke for the concubine, even though she was giving up her child. Why was this beneficial? Because once adopted, the child instantly changed his status from shoe to die, from a secondary, politically vulnerable son to the legitimate, unassailable crown prince. The concubine's power, which was once based on the king's personal love, now became anchored to the queen's legal authority. She had used a legal fiction to secure dynastic reality. Her social standing would dramatically change too. She was now the biological mother of the crown prince, a fact that everyone in the palace knew despite the legal paperwork. Her son was raised with the full prestige, wealth, and educational resources afforded to the chief heir, making him a far more prepared and powerful future ruler than if he had been raised solely in the concubine's lesser chambers. One mainstream historical fact demonstrating this is the common practice in Roman imperial families and the Japanese imperial court, where biological sons of favored concubines or even nephews were formally adopted by the empress to secure the line of succession and lend legitimacy to the new ruler. This preserved the appearance of dynastic continuity and the empress's reproductive role, even if the biological truth was widely known. The legal fiction was often more important than the actual bloodline. The quirky or fringe tidbit here involves the adoption tax levied on the queen. While the queen gained the stability of having an heir, she often had to pay a heavy, non-monetary price to the concubine. This payment was usually guaranteed elevation for the concubine to a higher, more secure rank, generous financial endowments, and often an unspoken pact that the queen would never use her authority to harm the concubine's biological family. The concubine leveraged her biological success into a permanent upgrade of her political status, turning a temporary advantage into an enduring guarantee. Think about the psychological advantage. The concubine, having given the heir to the queen, could now operate from a position of moral superiority and quiet confidence. The queen, though legally the mother, was often deeply indebted and perpetually insecure, knowing the biological mother was right down the hall and could potentially leverage that powerful, unseverable biological bond if her interests were threatened. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of legal adoption in these scenarios was a sign of the queen's ultimate power, her ability to formally claim any child as her own, or a sign of her ultimate weakness, her complete reliance on a rival concubine to provide the necessary heir. Was the queen the winner for gaining the heir, or was the concubine the winner for guaranteeing her bloodline's ascension? The concubine in this situation held the powerful trump card, the enduring biological reality behind the legal paperwork. We've seen the concubine's influence peak with her son on the throne, but now we must address the final, often longest phase of her power, the era after the ruler who first elevated her is gone. This is where we examine the long shadow concubines after the king's death. When the concubine's sole source of personal affection and protection dies, the entire political structure shifts violently. For a queen, her status as the queen mother or dowager is assured and legally defined. For a concubine, her future hinges entirely on the success and loyalty of her children. If she bore no sons or daughters who married into powerful houses, her power vanishes, and she is relegated to the silence of the convent or a forgotten corner of the palace. However, if her son ascends the throne, a victory we discussed in Section 9, the former concubine transforms into a powerful dowager matriarch. Her power is no longer soft or intimate. It is now institutionalized and publicly recognized. The son, now the emperor, cannot afford to ignore her, nor can the court. Her informal network, the harem underground, and her loyal eunuch allies now become the foundation of her son's new administration. She has, through her son, finally acquired the formal power the queen always possessed. This dowager matriarch status allows her to maintain influence in three critical ways. First, she controls the inner court, the appointments of the palace staff, the selection of the king's new consorts, and the management of the royal household. This gives her control over the king's daily life and his emotional surroundings. Second, she becomes the king's most trusted, non-threatening political counselor. He trusts her advice because she is dependent on his success, and she has no external political family to serve. Remember that advantage from Section 3. Third, and most powerfully, she often acts as the regent if her son is a minor. This is the ultimate victory. The concubine, whose power began in a quiet bedchamber, now holds the reins of the entire empire. One mainstream historical fact demonstrating this enduring power is the prevalence of regency periods, dominated by queen mothers or dowagers who were originally low-ranking consorts. Empress Dowager Cixi of China is a prime example. Though her initial rank was high, her career shows the lasting influence of a politically savvy mother. She served as regent for two child emperors and was the de facto ruler of China for nearly half a century after her husband's death, wielding power far surpassing that of the actual empresses. The quirky or fringe tidbit here is the elaborate, ritualistic use of private chambers even after achieving dowager status. The dowager matriarch often chose to receive certain key officials not in the formal large halls of state, but in her own smaller, more intimate private chambers. This was a deliberate use of spatial power. By making the official enter her personal space, she put them at an immediate psychological disadvantage, signaling that this was not a meeting between two officials, but between a supreme matriarch and her subordinate. She continued to use the soft psychological tactics of her concubine days, simply applied on a grander scale. Recall that crocodile dung sunscreen we were just musing about the concubine's enduring legacy, is that she managed to take the subtle, messy, often repulsive truth of human nature, jealousy, favoritism, private deals, and turn it into a magnificent, long-term dynastic victory. Historians still argue whether the power wielded by a dowager matriarch was an extension of her late husband's will acting as his trusted proxy, or an independent exercise of personal political genius, finally unfettered by the necessity of managing the king's moods. Regardless, her long shadow proves that the concubine's quiet, persistent labor resulted in power that could easily outlast the reign of her royal lover and her nominal queen rival. Our narrative has heavily favored the concubine's success, making the queen seem like a powerless figurehead. But that is an incomplete picture. We must now acknowledge that the queen held a crucial, ultimate weapon, the very legal and ceremonial power the concubine sought to undermine. We are now exploring the queen's revenge when formal power strikes back. Remember that while the concubine's power was personal, volatile, and dependent on the king's mood, the queen's power was legal, structural, and institutional. Her authority, while slow-moving, was cemented in law, backed by dynastic tradition, and supported by a political machine, her family, the highest-ranking ministers, the official bureaucracy that often spanned generations. When a queen finally strategically mobilized this legal power, the results were often devastating and final for her rivals. The queen, tired of the drama and threats posed by a favored concubine, could use her legal authority to brutally suppress her rivals in ways the concubine never could. The concubine was forced to use rumors and subtle manipulation. The queen could use state law official investigation and public execution. Crucially, the queen's family often held high military or judicial positions. If a concubine slipped up, if she was caught in a moment of illicit communication, used a forbidden charm, or allowed a relative to overstep their minor official position, the queen's loyal ministers could initiate a formal legal investigation. The concubine would be defenseless as her power was unofficial and could not withstand a legal challenge. One mainstream historical fact demonstrating this is the consistent use of accusations of witchcraft or treason against concubines in courts like the Joseon dynasty in Korea or the Ottoman Empire. These accusations, often politically motivated by the queen's faction, were devastating. Once the accusation was officially lodged, the queen could oversee the formal judicial process, ensuring the trial was swift, and the verdict, usually exile, imprisonment, or death, was carried out by the state, thereby sanitizing the elimination of a rival. This wasn't personal. It was state-sanctioned justice. The quirky or fringe tidbit here relates to the concept of ritual cleansing after a concubine's execution. In some cultures, after a disgraced concubine was killed, the queen would preside over elaborate rituals to cleanse the palace grounds, purify the king's reputation, and officially erase the concubine's name from all records, sometimes even forcing the concubine's own child, the Shu son, to participate in her condemnation. This was the ultimate assertion of formal power, not just eliminating the body, but attempting to erase the memory and the dynastic trace, something the concubine, for all her wits, could never achieve. Remember the Harem Underground Section 6. The Queen's revenge often involved a spectacular public dismantling of these networks. She would identify the concubine's key eunuch and servant informants and have them publicly tortured and executed, sending a terrifying message to all other low-level informants about the cost of disloyalty. This instantly collapsed the concubine's intelligence advantage. Historians still argue whether the queen's eventual use of legal power was a sign of her strength, the ultimate supremacy of law, or a sign of her desperation. Having failed to counter the concubine's soft power, she was forced to resort to brute force. Nevertheless, when the queen struck back, she used the law as a blunt final instrument, proving that while a concubine might win the daily battles for the king's heart, the queen still held the political and legal right to win the war. The light slipper of the concubine could be swiftly crushed by the heavy iron boot of the queen's legal authority. We come now to the final quiet reflection on our journey through the velvet-lined corridors of royal ambition. We have witnessed the Queen's rigid, formal authority and the concubine's subtle personal influence. Our concluding thought focuses on the legacy of the lighter hand, how the enduring influence of concubines showcases the eternal victory of soft, informal power over rigid, formal authority. The core of the matter, as we've discovered, is that the Queen was tasked with upholding the institution of the monarchy, while the concubine was tasked with tending to the man who was the monarch. The institution is massive, slow, and often ungrateful. The man is vulnerable, easily flattered, and prone to personal weakness. The concubine, by focusing her energy on the king's personal, emotional, and psychological needs, remember the emotional economy of the bedchamber. Section 5 gained control over the ultimate decision-maker, bypassing the entire cumbersome legal and political structure that the Queen was forced to serve. The Queen's power, being public and legal, was subject to public opinion, ministerial oversight, and the constant threat of being countermanded by a formal vote or a treaty shift. It was a power that required permission to wield. The concubine's power, being private and emotional, was subject only to the king's personal caprice, which she was expertly positioned to manage and manipulate. Her power required only access. This distinction is the final takeaway. Access is faster than authority. The concubine could introduce a political idea, suggest a judicial favor, or plant a seed of doubt. Remember the subtle gossip from the Harem Underground, Section 6, in a matter of minutes during a quiet dinner. The Queen would need to schedule a formal audience consult with her family, draft a petition, and get it approved by a committee. In the high-stakes, instant reaction environment of an imperial court, the ability to act invisibly and immediately often trumped the right to act legally and openly. Recall the heavy political marriage alliances that weighed down the Queen, Section 3. The concubine was light flexible and beholden to no external power, a clean slate entirely dependent on the king, which paradoxically made her a far more trustworthy confidant in his loneliest moments. She was the one who could speak truth to the man, while the Queen was only allowed to speak duty to the office. One mainstream historical fact to leave you with is the sheer statistical number of major dynastic shifts and appointments that can be traced back to a ruler's favored consort or concubine rather than the input of his queen or official council. Throughout Chinese, Ottoman, and Byzantine history, the record is clear, informal, intimate influence repeatedly provided the shortest path to power, often sidelining centuries of tradition and legal precedent. The quirky tidbit that best summarizes the concubine's victory is the enduring power of the secret gift. While the Queen's gifts to the king were official large and recorded symbols of state, the concubines were small, personalized, and private. A rare, perfectly chosen antique, a poem written in his honor, a dish cooked exactly to his private taste. These private tokens accumulated into a massive emotional debt that the king felt compelled to repay, often through vast political favors, the small gifts and quiet favors, Section 8. Historians still argue whether this pattern of soft power's dominance is a fundamental indictment of absolute monarchy, proving that even the most supreme authority can be undone by personal bias and intimacy, or simply a reflection of human nature, that the personal need for affection and comfort will always override legal and political obligation. In the end, the concubine's legacy is a quiet, powerful reminder that the throne is ultimately occupied by a human being, and the key to power lies not in controlling the institution, but in controlling the heart of the individual who runs it. Now let that thought settle. The palace doors are closing, and the last scents of sandalwood and jasmine are fading. You can stop walking now. You have done well to make it through the labyrinthine logic of the Harem underground and the cold calculus of court politics. Allow the weighty complexity of empires, queens, and concubines to drift from your mind. There is no more need to dissect strategy or analyze ambition. The jade floors are still cold, but the air is still and quiet. Take a deep, slow breath and let the gentle rhythm of the history wash over you, pulling you down into the silence. The queen and the concubine, the political rivalry, the jealous whispers and the deadly plots, it all belongs to the past, now melting into the comforting darkness. Focus on the soft background hum of the fan, or perhaps the distant sound of quiet rain. You are safe here, drifting above the noise of the past. Let the final echoes of soft power and rigid duty fade into a smooth, even silence. There are no more demands, no more alliances to forge, and no more titles to worry about. Just rest. Good night. Sweet dreams.